All right, we're still working out all the documents that we can have to look at. We can do this on our internet, get sources from all over the world, tens of thousands of documents. I have word search or other kinds of Bible sorts of things. I have the word search on my website and get to go to look at the original text and variances therein of the various documents. Also, there are several books on manuscript evidence to give explanation of which manuscript is superior to the other one, depending upon the age and so on. Well, in the meantime, I got an email from a fellow, and he asked me, well, I believe in my dreams about the internet, and I would like to know what your idea is on the afterlife. So, I went to, let's go to a website. I went to my research on my website and elsewhere. I developed an answer, which is here, posted, and I sent it the copy of this to him. It's an important point, and it's relevant to this point of proving out the reliability of any source of information. So this fellow asks the question, is there an afterlife? And he presents his dreams as evidence. Well, you start first. The first thing one must do in order to determine the truth of any matter is to find a reliable source of the information on the subject you are investigating, and in your case, is there an afterlife? That search must be strictly made within the rules of a reliable method of determining the truth from the reliable source. A scientific method, if you will, utilizing the 4 key points of determining scientific fact. It has to be observable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable, following the established normative rules of language, context, and logic of the language one is communicating in to perform such a scientific operation and get a reliable, trustworthy result. Notice that most scientific treatises are presented to the public and to colleagues in a language form. And you have to be very accurate when you're presenting important points in science. And there are a lot of details, so they have certain kind of language there. Same thing with anything that you've written as an account, like whether there is an afterlife or not. So according to science, the scientific method is limited by that which can be observed, tested, reproduced, and falsified. And that which lies outside of these parameters is not science, but it is in the realm of the untestable, the unproved, and therefore unreliable. Maybe many people believe in this, but where's the testing? Where's the falsifiability? Where's the reproductive or reproduced capacity? But now we have arrived at the first hurdle in the case of afterlife. Can the afterlife be observed, tested, reproduced, and falsified? The answer is no. So then we must find a reliable source of information that addresses the subject of the afterlife by utilizing the established normative rules of language, context, and logic, which provides the most plausible description of the afterlife. Dreams are not provably reliable because they neither can be observed, nor tested, nor reproduced, nor falsified, especially person to person, time to time, account, book to book. For when dreams which occurred at different times and or with different people and or are described via authors' extra-biblical accounts of them are compared to one another in detail and scientifically, they prove to be contradictory and illogical. They don't follow rules of logic. They draw conclusions that aren't warranted. Hence, they do not prove to be consistent and reliable. On the other hand, the Bible's accounts of such a thing as the afterlife, when examined properly, scientifically are wholly consistent and without contradiction, based on that which is provable. Dreams can't be reproduced, but the consistent authors, the consistent non-contradictory reports, and some of the logic involved are without fault. Since it can be observed that the Bible, all 66 books, which are authored by some 40-plus authors over a period of over 1,500 years, which have been properly and accurately translated from the most reliable manuscripts of the original language text as determined by the proper rules of interpretation into the most accurate versions of the languages of the world, indeed does address this topic of the afterlife. And since such an interpretation has an extremely, even supernatural, inerrant, reliable reputation for being a source of great significance, it behooves one to examine it in order to rule it in or rule it out as a reliable source on this subject by each individual of accountable age. For upon a careful examination of the Bible, it becomes evident that the authors who wrote every word exclusively utilized the normative rules of language, context, and logic, and in the absence of evidence anywhere in the Bible or elsewhere that it is to be interpreted with a specialized set of rules outside of what man to whom the Bible was written would normally expect, and in view of the evidence that a strict adherence to the normative rules of language, context, and logic produces the most trustworthy, non-contradictory, immutable, consistent interpretation, we must thereupon follow the writer's plan of how to interpret the work of the Bible. So having studied the topic of the afterlife and other topics that are closely related to it, we can be confident that we indeed do have a trustworthy source for determining what happens when one dies. Until something better comes along, we haven't seen anybody, but we have testimony of Jesus Christ coming back from the dead. And his testimony is witnessed by a number of eyewitnesses, so that we have some testimony of somebody who did come back from the dead. And we have other testimony about the afterlife as well that seems trustworthy enough that till something better comes along, go with the Bible. It's got so much testimony toward it in terms of documentation. Men wrote it, yes, but we have so much, tens of thousands of documents that have been poured over the centuries, and we have a 1% variance, which all of these can be resolved, so we pretty much know what the original text is. Now it's just a matter, here's what we're talking about here, the reliability of the Bible. Manuscripts, citations, all these manuscript kinds. You have New Testament manuscripts of various types, early church fathers, historical documents, gathering people who've examined these translations into other languages. The early church fathers have quoted all but 11 verses in the New Testament, lectionaries. The early church fathers here. External evidence of historical value. It corroborates every single thing that it corroborates as accurate without contradicting anything. Archaeology, go into archaeology. Then we have Roman historians. When we go into the Old Testament, same, lots and lots of documentation and studies. So we can authenticate that what we have as the Bible without worrying about whether there are contradictions or errors in it. We have an accurate rendition of what was originally texted and written. Then we have the subject itself. You go into the study of the afterlife. We have 3 studies I've done based on, as close as I can, the evidence, immortality, and everlasting and biblical perspective. Provides no room for soul sleep or annihilation. We have that study you can look at. Sheol, Hades, Paradise, and Gehenna. You can look at that, which we've gone over. And then Heaven Bound. Believers go directly to heaven when they die with a testimony. This is what the Bible teaches, and there's no contradiction within this. We also can go back to the proper approach on how to read. This is a lesson on how to read, interpreting the Bible, which is pretty much how to read a document, except additional procedures on how to translate from an ancient language to one that you're currently using, like American English in the 21st century. So that we have that. Now let's go back to where we were in the documentation of the New Testament to make sure that the New Testament documentation is consistent and we have a trustworthy document, at least what the original authors wrote. Talmudic writings. So we can look for Talmudic writings. The Talmudic writings, let's make this a little bigger. Talmudic writings of most value concerning the historical Jesus are those compiled between AD 70 and 200 during the so-called Tannaitic period. The most significant text is Sanhedrin 43a. On the eve of Passover, Yeshua Jesus was hanged. The 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Babylonian Talmud. New Testament details confirmed by this passage include the fact that and the time of the crucifixion, as well as the intent of the Jewish religious leaders to kill Jesus. Let's go back to Talmudic. Okay. Lucian of Samosata was a 2nd century Greek writer whose works contained sarcastic critiques of Christianity. The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified in the account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers. From the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws, all this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. We have Marabar Seropion, a Syrian. Marabar Seropion wrote to his son Seropion sometime between the late 1st and early 3rd centuries. The letter contains an apparent reference to Jesus. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Simone gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died off of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and Jews, ruined and driven from the land, live in dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. British Museum. Now we have Valentinus and the Gnostics. Valentinus' book confirms that Jesus was an historical person. But when they had seen him and heard, he granted them to taste him and to smell him and to touch the beloved Son, when he had appeared instructing them about the Father, for he came by means of fleshly appearance. Jesus was patient in accepting suffering, since he knows that his death is life for many. He was nailed to a tree. He published the edict of the Father on the cross. He draws himself down to death through life. Having stripped himself of the perishable rags, he put on imperishability, which no one can possibly take away from him. These are extra-biblical accounts. Pontius Pilate. Although a purportedly official document, the Acts of Pontius Pilate does not survive. It is referred to by Justin Martyr in about AD 150 and by Tertullian in about AD 200. Justin writes, "And the expression, 'they pierced my hands and my feet,' was used in reference to the nails of the cross, which were fixed in his hands and feet. And after he was crucified, they cast lots upon his vesture, and they that crucified him parted it among them. And that these things did happen, you can ascertain from Acts of Pontius Pilate." We have extra-biblical testimony. We have archaeology. While books are not large enough to contain all the finds that have bolstered confidence in the historical reliability of the Bible, no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a Bible reference, a biblical reference. Events surrounding the birth of Jesus. Archaeological discoveries show that the Romans had a regular enrollment of taxpayers and also held censuses for every 14 years. This procedure was indeed begun under Augustus, and the first took place in either 23 to 22 BC or in 9 to 8 BC. We find evidence of that Quirinius was governor of Syria around 7 BC. This assumption is based on an inscription found in Antioch ascribing to Quirinius this post. He was governor twice, once in 7 BC and the other time in 6 AD, the date ascribed by Josephus. In regard to the practices of enrollment,